This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 6, Chapters 11 through 19.
Part 6, Chapter 11. People who read my war dispatches will remember my first descriptions of the tanks and those of other correspondents. They caused a sensation, a sense of excitement, laughter which shook the nation because of the comicality, the grotesque surprise, the possibility of quicker victory, which caught hold of the imagination of people who heard for the first time of those new engines of war, so beast-like in appearance and performance. The vagueness of our descriptions was due to the censorship, which forbade, wisely enough, any technical and exact definition, so that we had to compare them to giant toads, mammoths, and prehistoric animals of all kinds. Our accounts did, however, reproduce the psychological effect of the tanks upon the British troops when these engines appeared for the first time to their astonished gaze on September 13th. Our soldiers roared with laughter, as I did when they saw them lolloping up the roads. On the morning of the great battle of September 15th, the presence of the tanks going into action excited all the troops along the front with a sense of comical relief in the midst of the grim and deadly business of attack. Men followed them, laughing and cheering. There was a wonderful thrill in the airman's message, tank walking up the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind. Wounded boys whom I met that morning grinned, in spite of their wounds at our first word about the tanks. "Crikey," said a Cockney lad of the 47th Division. "I can't help laughing every time I think of them tanks. I saw them stamping down German machine guns as though they were wasps' nests. The adventures of Cream de Menthe, Cordon Rouge, and the Bing boys on both sides of the Bapaume Road, when they smashed down barbed wire, climbed over trenches, sat on German redoubts, and received the surrender of German prisoners who held their hands up to these monsters and cried, 'Kamerad,' were like fairy tales of war by H.G. Wells. Yet their romance had a sharp edge of reality, as I saw in those battles of the Somme, and afterward, more grievously, in the Cambrai salient and Flanders, when the tanks were put out of action by direct hits of field guns, and nothing of humankind remained in them but the charred bones of their gallant crews. Before the battle in September of 16, I talked with the pilots of the first tanks, and although they were convinced of the value of these new engines of war, and were out to prove it, they did not disguise from me, nor from their own souls, that they were going forth upon a perilous adventure with the odds of luck against them. I remember one young pilot, a tiny fellow like a jockey, who took me on one side and said, "I want you to do me a favor," and then scribbled down his mother's address and asked me to write to her if anything happened to him. He and other tank officers were anxious. They had not complete confidence in the steering and control of their engines. It was a difficult and clumsy kind of gear, which was apt to break down at a critical moment, as I saw when I rode in one on their field of maneuver. These first tanks were only experimental, and the tail arrangement was very weak. Worse than all mechanical troubles was the short-sighted policy of some authority at GH, who had insisted upon ASC drivers being put to this job a few days before the battle without proper training. "It is mad and murderous," said one of the officers. "These fellows may have pluck. All right, I don't doubt it, but they don't know their engines, nor the double steering trick, and they have never been under shell fire. It is asking for trouble." As it turned out, the ASC drivers proved their pluck, for the most part, splendidly, but many tanks broke down before they reached the enemy's lines, and in that action and later battles there were times when they bitterly disappointed the infantry commanders and the troops. Individual tanks, commanded by gallant young officers and served by brave crews, did astounding feats, and some of these men came back dazed and deaf and dumb after 40 hours or more of fighting and maneuvering within steel walls, intensely hot, filled with the fumes of their engines, jolted and banged about over rough ground, and steering an uncertain course after the loss of their tails, which had snapped at the spine. But there had not been anything like enough tanks to secure an annihilating surprise over the enemy, as afterward was attained in the first battle of Cambrai, and the troops who had been buoyed up with the hope that at last the machine gun evil was going to be scotched were disillusioned, dejected, when they saw tanks ditched behind the lines or nowhere in sight, when once again they had to trudge forward under the flail of machine gun bullets from earthwork redoubts. It was a failure in generalship to give away our secret before it could be made effective. I remember sitting in a mess of the Gordons in the village of Franvillas along the Albert Road and listening to a long monologue by a Gordon officer on the future of the tanks. He was a dreamer and visionary, and his fellow officers laughed at him. "A few tanks are no good," he said. 40 or 50 tanks are no good on a modern battlefront. We want hundreds of tanks, brought up secretly, fed with ammunition by tank carriers, bringing up field guns and going into action without any preliminary barrage. They can smash through the enemy's wire and get over his trenches before he is aware that an attack has been organized. Up to now, all our offensives have been futile because of our preliminary advertisement by prolonged bombardment. The tanks can bring back surprise to modern warfare, but we must have hundreds of them." Prolonged laughter greeted this speech. But the Celtic dreamer did not smile. He was staring into the future, and what he saw was true, though he did not live to see it. For in the Cambrai Battle of November 11th, the tanks did advance in hundreds and gained an enormous surprise over the enemy and led the way to a striking victory, which turned to tragedy because of risks too lightly taken. Part 6, Chapter 12. One branch of our military machine developed with astonishing rapidity and skill during those summer battles. The young gentlemen of the Air Force went all out for victory and were reckless in audacity. How far they acted under orders and against their own judgment of what was sensible and sound in fighting risks I do not know. General Trenchard, their supreme chief, believed in an aggressive policy at all costs, and was a Napoleon in this war of the skies, intolerant of timidity, not squeamish of heavy losses if the balance were tipped against the enemy. Some young flying men complained to me bitterly that they were expected to fly or die over the German lines, whatever the weather or whatever the risks. Many of them, after repeated escapes from anti-aircraft shells and hostile craft, lost their nerve, shirked another journey, found themselves crying in their tents, and were sent back home for a spell by squadron commanders, with quick observation for the breaking point, or made a few more flights and fell to earth like broken birds. Sooner or later, apart from rare cases, every man was found to lose his nerve, unless he lost his life first. That was a physical and mental law. But until that time, these flying men were the knights errant of the war, and most of them did not need any driving to the risks they took with boyish recklessness. They were mostly boys' babes, as they seemed to me when I saw them in their tents or dismounting from their machines. On dud days, when there was no visibility at all, they spent their leisure hours joy-riding to Amiens or some other town where they could have a binge. They drank many cocktails and roared with laughter over bottles of cheap champagne and flirted with any girl who happened to come within their orbit. If not allowed beyond their tents, they sulked like baby Achilles, reading novelettes with their knees hunched up, playing the gramophone, and ragging each other. There was one child so young that his squadron leader would not let him go out across the battle lines to challenge any German scout in the clouds, or do any of the fancy stunts that were part of the next day's program. He went to bed sulkily, and then came back again in his pajamas with rumpled hair. "Look here, sir," he said. "Can't I go? I've got my wings. It's perfectly rotten being left behind." The squadron commander, who told me of the tale, yielded. "All right, only don't do any fool tricks." Next morning the boy flew off, played a lone hand, chased a German scout, dropped low over the enemy's lines, machine-gunned infantry on the march, scattered them, bombed a train, chased a German motor car, and after many adventures came back alive and said, "I've had a rare old time." On a stormy day, which loosened the tent poles and slapped the wet canvas, I sat in a mess with a group of flying officers, drinking tea out of a tin mug. One boy, the youngest of them, had just brought down his first Hun. He told me the tale of it with many details, his eyes alight as he described the fight. They had maneuvered round each other for a long time. Then he shot his man in passant. The machine crashed on our side of the lines. He had taken off the iron crosses on the wings and a bit of the propeller, as mementos. He showed me these things while the squadron commander, who had brought down 24 Germans, winked at me and told me he was going to send them home to hang beside his college trophies. I guessed he was less than 19 years old. Such a kid. A few days later, when I went to the tent again, I asked about him. "How's that boy who brought down his first Hun?" The squadron commander said, "Didn't you hear? He's gone west. Brought down in a dogfight. He had a chance of escape, but went back to rescue a pal. A nice boy." They became fatalists after a few fights and believed in their luck, or their mascots, teddy bears, a bullet that had missed them, china dolls, a girl's lock of hair, a silver ring. Yet at the back of their brains, most of them, I fancy, knew that it was only a question of time before they went west, and with that subconscious thought they crowded in all life intensely in the hours that were given to them, seized all chance of laughter, of wine, of every kind of pleasure within reach, and said their prayers, some of them, with great fervor, between one escape and another, like young Paul Bencher, who has revealed his soul in verse, his secret terror, his tears, his hatred of death, his love of life, when he went bombing over Bruges. On the mornings of the battles of the Somme, I saw them as the heralds of a new day of strife, flying toward the lines in the first light of dawn. When the sun rose, its rays touched their wings, made them white like cabbage butterflies, or changed them to silver, all a sparkle. I saw them fly over the German positions, not changing their course. Then, all about them burst black puffs of German shrapnel, so that many times I held my breath, because they seemed in the center of the burst. But generally, when the cloud cleared, they were flying again, until they disappeared in the mists over the enemy's country. There they did deadly work, in single fights with German airmen, or against great odds, until they had an air space to themselves and skimmed the earth like albatrosses in low flight, attacking machine gun nests, killing or scattering the gunners by a burst of bullets from their Lewis guns, dropping bombs on German wagon transports, infantry, railway trains. One man cut a train in half and saw men and horses falling out, and ammunition dumps, directing the fire of our guns upon living targets, photographing new trenches and works, bombing villages crowded with German troops. That they struck terror into these German troops was proved afterward when we went into Bapaume and Peronne, and many villages from which the enemy retreated after the battles of the Somme. Everywhere there were signboards on which was written Fliegerschutz, aircraft shelter, or German warnings of keep to the sidewalks. This road is constantly bombed by British airmen. They were a new plague of war, and did for a time gain a complete mastery of the air. But later the Germans learned the lesson of low flying and night bombing, and in 1917 and 1918 came back in greater strength, and made the nights horrible in camps behind the lines, and in villages, where they killed many soldiers and more civilians. The infantry did not believe much in our air supremacy at any time, not knowing what work was done beyond their range of vision, and seeing our machines crashed in no man's land, and hearing the rattle of machine guns from hostile aircraft above their own trenches. Those aviators of ours, a general said to me, are the biggest liars in the world, cocky fellows claiming impossible achievements. What proof can they give of their preposterous tales? They only go into the air service because they haven't the pluck to serve in the infantry. That was prejudice. The German losses were proof enough of our men's fighting skill and strength, and German prisoners and German letters confirmed all their claims. But we were dishonest in our reckoning from first to last, and the British public was hoodwinked about our losses. 3 of our machines are missing. 6 of our machines are missing. Yes, but what about the machines which crashed in no man's land and behind our lines? They were not missing but destroyed, and the boys who had flown in them were dead or broken. To the end of the war, those aviators of ours searched the air for their adventures, fought often against overwhelming numbers, killed the German champions in single combat or in tourneys in the sky, and let down tons of high explosives which caused great death and widespread destruction. And in this work they died like flies, and one boy's life, one of those laughing, fatalistic, intensely living boys, was of no more account in the general sum of slaughter than a summer midge, except as one little unit in the armies of the air. Part 6, Chapter 13. I am not strong enough in the science of psychology to understand the origin of laughter and to get into touch with the mainsprings of gaiety. The sharp contrast between normal ethics and an abnormality of action provides a grotesque point of view, arousing ironical mirth. It is probable also that surroundings of enormous tragedy stimulate the sense of humor of the individual, so that any small, ridiculous thing assumes the proportion of monstrous absurdity. It is also likely certain, I think, that laughter is an escape from terror, a liberation of the soul by mental explosion, from the prison walls of despair and brooding. In the Decameron of Boccaccio, a group of men and women encompassed by plague retired into seclusion to tell one another mirthful immoralities which stirred their laughter. They laughed while the plague destroyed society around them, and when they knew that its foul germs were on the prowl for their own bodies. So it was in this war, where in many strange places and in many dreadful days there was great laughter. I think sometimes of a night I spent with the medical officers of a tent hospital in the fields of the Somme during those battles. With me as a guest went a modern Falstaff, a ton of flesh, who sweats to death and lards the lean earth as he walks along. He was a man of many anecdotes, drawn from the sinks and stews of life, yet with a sense of beauty lurking under his coarseness, and a voice of fine, sonorous tone, which he managed with art and a melting grace. On the way to the field hospital he had taken more than one nip of whiskey. His voice was well oiled when he sang a greeting to a medical major in a florid burst of melody from Italian opera. The major was a little Irish medico who had been through the South African War and in tropical places where he had drunk fire water to kill all manner of microbes. He suffered abominably from asthma and had had a heart seizure the day before our dinner at his mess, and told us that he would drop down dead as sure as fate between one operation and another on the poor, bloody wounded who never ceased to flow into his tent. But he was in a laughing mood and thirsty for laughter making liquid. He had 2 whiskies before the dinner began to wet his whistle. His fellow officers were out for an evening's joy, but nervous of the colonel, an austere soul who sat at the head of the mess with the look of a man afraid that merriment might reach outrageous heights beyond his control. A courteous man he was, and rather sad. His presence for a time acted as a restraint upon the company until all restraint was broken by the Falstaff with me, who told soul-crashing stories to the little Irish major across the table and sang love lyrics to the orderly who brought round the cottage pie and pickles. There was a tall, thin young surgeon who had been carving up living bodies all day and many days, and now listened to that fat rogue with an intensity of delight that lit up his melancholy eyes, watching him gravely between gusts of deep laughter, which seemed to come from his boots. There was another young surgeon, once of Bart's, who made himself the cup server of the fat knight, and kept his wine at the brim, and encouraged him to fresh audacities of anecdotry, with a humorous glance at the colonel's troubled face. The colonel was forgotten after dinner. The little Irish major took the lid off the boiling pot of mirth. He was entirely mad, as he assured us, between dances of a wild and primitive type, stories of adventure in far lands, and spasms of asthmatic coughing when he beat his breast and said, "A pox in my bleeding heart." Falstaff was playing Juliet to the Romeo of the tall young surgeon, singing falsetto like a fat German angel dressed in loose-fitting khaki, with his belt undone. There were charades in the tent. The boy from Bart's did remarkable imitations of a gamecock challenging a rival bird, of a cow coming through a gate, of a general addressing his troops, most comical of all. Several glasses were broken. The corkscrew was disregarded as a useless implement, and whiskey bottles were decapitated against the tent poles. I remember vaguely the crowning episode of the evening when the little major was dancing the Irish jig with a kitchen chair, when Falstaff was singing the prologue of Pagliacci to the stupefied colonel, when the boy, once of Bart's, was roaring like a lion under the mess table, and when the tall, melancholy surgeon was at the top of the tent pole, scratching himself like a gorilla in his native haunts. Outside, the field hospital was quiet, under a fleecy sky with a crescent moon. Through the painted canvas of the tent city candle light glowed with a faint rose-colored light, and the Red Cross hung limp above the camp where many wounded lay, waking or sleeping, tossing in agony, dying in unconsciousness. Far away over the fields, rockets were rising above the battle lines. The sky was flickering with the flush of gunfire. A red glare rose and spread below the clouds where some ammunition dump had been exploded. Old Falstaff fell asleep in the car on the way back to our quarters, and I smiled at the memory of great laughter in the midst of tragedy. Part 6, Chapter 14. The struggle of men from one low ridge to another low ridge in a territory 40 miles wide by more than 20 miles deep, during 5 months of fighting, was enormous in its intensity and prolongation of slaughter, wounding, and endurance of all hardships and terrors of war. As an eyewitness, I saw the full scope of the bloody drama. I saw day by day the tidal waves of wounded limping back, until 250,000 men had passed through our casualty clearing stations, and then were not finished. I went among these men when the blood was wet on them, and talked with hundreds of them, and heard their individual narratives of escapes from death until my imagination was saturated with the spirit of their conflict of body and soul. I saw a green, downy countryside, beautiful in its summer life, ravaged by gunfire, so that the white chalk of its subsoil was flung above the earth and grass in a wide, sterile stretch of desolation pitted with shell craters, ditched by deep trenches, whose walls were hideously upheaved by explosive fire, and littered yard after yard, mile after mile, with broken wire, rifles, bombs, unexploded shells, rags of uniform, dead bodies, or bits of bodies, and all the filth of battle. I saw many villages flung into ruin or blown clean off the map. I walked into such villages as Canton-le-Son, Martinpuich-les-Sars, Tilloy, and at last Bapaume, when a smell of burning and the fumes of explosives and the stench of dead flesh rose up to one's nostrils and one's very soul. When our dead and German dead lay about, and newly wounded came walking through the ruins, or were carried shoulder high on stretchers, and consciously and subconsciously the living, unwounded men who went through these places knew that death lurked about them, and around them, and above them, and at any second might make its pounce upon their own flesh. I saw our men going into battle with strong battalions, and coming out of it with weak battalions. I saw them in the midst of battle at Thiepval, at Contal-Malson, at Guillemont, by Loupart Wood, when they trudged toward lines of German trenches, bunching a little in groups, dodging shell bursts, falling in single figures or in batches, and fighting over the enemy's parapets. I sat with them in their dugouts before battle and after battle, saw their bodies gathered up for burial, heard their snuffle of death in hospital, sat by their bedside when they were sorely wounded. So the full tragic drama of that long conflict on the Somme was burned into my brain, and I was, as it were, a part of it, and I am still seared with its remembrance, and shall always be. But however deep the knowledge of tragedy, a man would be a liar if he refused to admit the heroism, the gallantry of youth, even the gaiety of men in these infernal months. Psychology on the Somme was not simple and straightforward. Men were afraid, but fear was not their dominating emotion, except in the worst hours. Men hated this fighting, but found excitement in it, often exultation, sometimes an intense stimulus of all their senses and passions before reaction and exhaustion. Men became gibbering idiots with shell shock, as I saw some of them, but others rejoiced when they saw our shells ploughing into the enemy's earthworks, laughed at their own narrow escapes, and at grotesque comicalities of this monstrous deviltry. The officers were proud of their men, eager for their honor and achievement. The men themselves were in rivalry with other bodies of troops, and proud of their own prowess. They were scornful of all that the enemy might do to them, yet acknowledged his courage and power. They were quick to kill him, yet quick also to give him a chance of life by surrender, and after that were 9 times out of 10 chivalrous and kindly, but incredibly brutal on the rare occasions when passion overcame them at some tale of treachery. They had the pride of the skilled laborer in his own craft, as machine gunners, bombers, raiders, trench mortar men, and were keen to show their skill, whatever the risks. They were healthy animals, with animal courage as well as animal fear, and they had, some of them, a spiritual and moral fervor which bade them risk death to save a comrade, or to save a position, or to kill the fear that tried to fetter them, or to lead men with greater fear than theirs. They lived from hour to hour and forgot the peril or the misery that had passed, and did not forestall the future by apprehension unless they were of sensitive mind, with the worst quality men might have in modern warfare imagination. They trained themselves to an intense egotism within narrow boundaries. 50 yards to the left, or 500, men were being pounded to death by shell fire. 50 yards to the right, or 500, men were being mowed down by machine gun fire. For the time being their particular patch was quiet. It was their luck. Why worry about the other fellow? The length of a traverse in a ditch called a trench might make all the difference between heaven and hell. Dead bodies were being piled up on one side of the traverse. A shell had smashed into the platoon next door. There was a nasty mess. Men sat under their own mud bank and scooped out a tin of bully beef and hoped nothing would scoop them out of their bit of earth. This protective egotism seemed to me the instinctive soul armor of men in dangerous places when I saw them in the line. In a little way, not as a soldier, but as a correspondent, taking only 1,000th part of the risks of fighting men, I found myself using this self-complacency. They were strafing on the left, shells were pitching on the right. Very nasty for the men in either of those places. Poor devils. But meanwhile I was on a safe patch, it seemed. Thank heaven for that. "Here," said an elderly officer, one of those rare exalted souls, who thought that death was a little thing to give for one's country's sake. "Here, we may be killed at any moment." He spoke the words in Contal-Maison with a glow in his voice, as though announcing glad tidings to a friend who was a war artist camouflaged as a lieutenant and new to the scene of battle. "But," said the soldier artist, adjusting his steel hat nervously, "I don't want to be killed. I hate the idea of it." He was the normal man. The elderly officer was abnormal. The normal man, soldier without camouflage, had no use for death at all. unless it was in connection with the fellow on the opposite side of the way. He hated the notion of it applied to himself. He fought ferociously, desperately, heroically to escape it. Yet there were times, many times, when he paid not the slightest attention to the near neighborhood of that grisly spectre, because in immediate, temporary tranquility he thrust the thought from his mind, and smoked a cigarette, and exchanged a joke with the fellow at his elbow. There were other times when, in a state of mental exaltation, or spiritual self-sacrifice, or physical excitement, he acted regardless of all risks, and did mad, marvelous, almost miraculous things, hardly conscious of his own acts, but impelled to do as he did by the passion within him, passion of love, passion of hate, passion of fear, or passion of pride. Those men moved like that, were the leaders, the heroes, and groups followed them sometimes because of their intensity of purpose and the infection of their emotion, and the comfort that came from their real or apparent self-confidence in frightful situations. Those who got through were astonished at their own courage. Many of them became convinced consciously or subconsciously that they were immune from shells and bullets. They walked through harassing fire with a queer sense of carelessness. They had escaped so often that some of them had a kind of disdain of shell bursts until, perhaps, one day something snapped in their nervous system, as often it did, and the bang of a door in a billet behind the lens, or a wreath of smoke from some domestic chimney, gave them a sudden shock of fear. Men differed wonderfully in their nerve resistance, and it was no question of difference in courage. In the mass, all our soldiers seemed equally brave. In the mass, they seemed astoundingly cheerful. In spite of all the abomination of that Somme fighting our troops before battle, and after battle a few days after, looked bright-eyed, free from haunting anxieties, and were easy in their way of laughter. It was optimism in the mass, heroism in the mass. It was only when one spoke to the individual, some friend who bared his soul a second, or some soldier ant in the multitude with whom one talked with truth, that one saw the hatred of a man for his job, the sense of doom upon him, the weakness that was in his strength, the bitterness of his grudge against a fate that forced him to go on in this way of life, the remembrance of a life more beautiful which he had abandoned, all mingled with those other qualities of pride and comradeship, and that illogical sense of humor which made up the strange complexity of his psychology. Part 6, Chapter 15. It was a colonel of the North Staffordshires who revealed to me the astounding belief that he was immune from shell fire, and I met other men afterward with the same conviction. He had just come out of desperate fighting in the neighborhood of Thiepval, where his battalion had suffered heavily, and at first he was rude and sullen in the hut. I gauged him as a hard northerner, without a shred of sentiment or the flicker of any imaginative light, a stern, ruthless man. He was bitter in his speech to me because the North Staffords were never mentioned in my dispatches. He believed that this was due to some personal spite, not knowing the injustice of our military censorship under the orders of GHQ. "Why the hell don't we get a word?" he asked. "Haven't we done as well as anybody, died as much?" I promised to do what I could, which was nothing to put the matter right, and presently he softened, and later was amazingly candid in self-revelation. "I have a mystical power," he said. "Nothing will ever hit me as long as I keep that power which comes from faith. It is a question of absolute belief in the domination of mind over matter. I go through any barrage unscathed because my will is strong enough to turn aside explosive shells and machine gun bullets. As matter, they must obey my intelligence. They are powerless to resist the mind of a man in touch with the universal spirit, as I am." He spoke quietly and soberly, in a matter-of-fact way. I decided that he was mad. That was not surprising. We were all mad, in one way or another, or at one time or another. It was the unusual form of madness that astonished me. I envied him his particular kink. I wished I could cultivate it as an aid to courage. He claimed another peculiar form of knowledge. He knew before each action, he told me, what officers and men of his would be killed in battle. He looked at a man's eyes and knew, and he claimed that he never made a mistake. He was sorry to possess that second sight, and it worried him. There were many men who had a conviction that they would not be killed, although they did not state it in the terms expressed by the colonel of the North Staffordshires. And it is curious that in some cases I know they were not mistaken, and are still alive. It was indeed a general belief that if a man funked being hit, he was sure to fall, that being the reverse side of the argument. I saw the serene cheerfulness of men in the places of death at many times and in many places, and I remember one group of friends on the Somme who revealed that quality to a high degree. It was when our front line ran just outside the village of Martinpirch to Courcelette, on the other side of the Bapaume Road, and when the 8th, 10th Gordons were there, after their fight through Longueville and over the ridge. It was the little crowd I have mentioned before in the Battle of Loos, and it was Leite, John Wood, who took me to the battalion headquarters located under some sandbags in a German dugout. All the way up to Contomalazen and beyond there were the signs of recent bloodshed and of present peril. Dead horses lay about, disemboweled by shell fire. Legs and arms protruded from shell craters where bodies lay half buried. Heavy crumps came howling through the sky and bursting with enormous noise here, there, and everywhere over that vast, desolate battlefield with its clumps of ruin and rows of dead trees. It was the devil's hunting ground, and I hated every yard of it. But John Wood, who lived in it, was astoundingly cheerful and a fine, sturdy, gallant figure in his kilted dress as he climbed over sandbags, walked on the top of communication trenches, not bothering to take cover, and skirting round hedges of barbed wire, apparently unconscious of the crumps that were bursting around. I found laughter and friendly greeting in a hole in the earth where the battalion staff was crowded. The colonel was courteous but busy. He rather deprecated the notion that I should go up farther, to the ultimate limit of our line. It was no use putting one's head into trouble without reasonable purpose, and the German guns had been blowing in sections of his new-made trenches. But John Wood was insistent that I should meet old Tom, afterward in command of the battalion. He had just been buried and dug out again. He would like to see me. So we left the cover of the dugout and took to the open again. Long lines of jocks were digging a support trench, digging with a kind of rhythmic movement as they threw up the earth with their shovels. Behind them was another line of jocks not working. They lay as though asleep, out in the open. They were the dead of the last advance. Captain Tom was leaning up against the wall of the front line trench, smoking a cigarette, with his steel hat on the back of his head, a handsome, laughing figure. He did not look like a man who had just been buried and dug out again. "It was a narrow shave," he said. "A beastly shell covered me with a ton of earth. Have a cigarette, won't you?" We gossiped as though in St. James's Street. Other young Scottish officers came up and shook hands and said, "Jolly weather, isn't it? What do you think of our little show?" Not one of them gave a glance at the line of dead men over there, behind their parados. They told me some of the funny things that had happened lately in the battalion, some grim jokes by tough jocks. They had a fine crowd of men. You couldn't beat them. Well, good morning. Must get on with the job. There was no anguish there, no sense of despair, no sullen hatred of this life, so near to death. They seemed to like it. They did not really like it. They only made the best of it, without gloom. I saw they did not like this job of battle, one evening in their mess behind the line. The colonel who commanded them at the time, Celt of the Celts, was in a queer mood. He was a queer man, aloof in his manner, a little fey. He was annoyed with 3 of his officers who had come back late from 3 days' Paris leave. They were giants but stood like schoolboys before their master while he spoke ironical, bitter words. Later in the evening he mentioned casually that they must prepare to go into the line again under special orders. What about the store of bombs, small arms, ammunition, machine guns? The officers were stricken into silence. They stared at one another as though to say, "What does the old man mean? Is this true?" One of them became rather pale, and there was a look of tragic resignation in his eyes. Another said, "Hell," in a whisper. The adjutant answered the colonel's questions in a formal way, but thinking hard and studying the colonel's face anxiously. "Do you mean to say we are going into the line again, sir? At once?" The colonel laughed. "I don't look so scared, all of you. It's only a field day for training." The officers of the Gordons breathed more freely. Poof! They had been fairly taken in by the old man's leg pulling. No, it was clear they did not find any real joy in the line. They would not choose a front-line trench as the most desirable place of residence. Part 6, Chapter 16. In queer psychology there was a strange mingling of the pitiful and comic among a division, the 35th, known as the Bantams. They were all volunteers, having been rejected by the ordinary recruiting officer on account of their diminutive stature, which was on an average 5 feet high, descending to 4 feet 6. Most of them came from Lancashire, Cheshire, Durham, and Glasgow, being the dwarfed children of industrial England and its mid-Victorian cruelties. Others were from London, banded together in a battalion of the Middlesex Regiment. They gave a shock to our French friends when they arrived as a division at the port of Boulogne. "Name of a dog," said the quayside loungers. "England is truly in a bad way. She is sending out her last reserves." "But they are the soldiers of Lilliput," exclaimed others. "It is terrible that they should send these little ones," said kind-hearted fishwives. Under the training of General Pye, who commanded them, they became smart and brisk in the ranks. They saluted like miniature guardsmen marched with quick little steps like clockwork soldiers. It was comical to see them strutting up and down as sentries outside divisional headquarters, with their bayonets high above their wee bodies. In trench warfare they did well, though the fire step had to be raised to let them see over the top, and in one raid captured a German machine gun which I saw in their hands, and hauled it back, a heavier weight than ours, like ants struggling with a stick of straw. In actual battle they were hardly strong enough, and could not carry all that burden of fighting kit, steel helmet, rifle, hand grenades, shovels, empty sandbags with which other troops went into action. So they were used as support troops mostly behind the Black Watch and other battalions near Bazentin and Longueville, and there these poor little men dug and dug, and dug like beavers and crouched in the cover they made under damnable fire, until many of them were blown to bits. There was no glory in their job, only filth and blood, but they held the ground and suffered it all, not gladly. They had a chance of taking prisoners at Longueville, where they rummaged in German dugouts after the line had been taken by the 15th Scottish Division and the 3D, and they brought back a number of enormous Bavarians who were like the Brobdingnagians to these little men of Lilliput and disgusted with that humiliation. I met the whole crowd of them after that adventure as they sat, half naked, picking the lice out of their shirts, and the conversation I had with them remains in my memory because of its grotesque humor and tragic comicality. They were excited and emotional, these stunted men. They cursed the war with the foulest curses of Scottish and Northern dialects. There was one fellow, the jester of them all, whose language would have made the poppies blush. With ironical laughter, outrageous blasphemy, grotesque imagery, he described the suffering of himself and his mates under barrage fire, which smashed many of them into bleeding pulp. He had no use for this war. He cursed the name of glory. He advocated a trade unionism among soldiers to down tools whenever there was a threat of war. He was a Bolshevist before Bolshevism. Yet he had no liking for Germans and desired to cut them into small bits, to slit their throats, to disembowel them. He looked homeward to a Yorkshire town and wondered what his missus would say if she saw him scratching himself like an ape, or lying with his head in the earth with shells bursting around him, or prodding Germans with a bayonet. "Oh," said that 5-foot hero, "there will be a lot of murder after this bloody war. What's human life? What's the value of one man's throat? We're trained up as murderers. I don't dislike it, mind you, and after the war we shall ne'er get out of the habit of it. It'll come that roll like." He was talking for my benefit, egged on to further audacities by a group of comrades who roared with laughter and said, "Go it, Bill. That's the stuff." Among these Lilliputians were fellows who sat aloof and sullen, or spoke of their adventure with its recent horror in their eyes. Some of them had big heads on small bodies, as though they suffered from water on the brain. Many of them were sent home afterward. General Haldon, as commander of the 6th Corps, paraded them and poked his stick at the more wizened ones, the obviously unfit, the generates, and said at each prod, "You can go, you. ... you." The Bantam Division ceased to exist. They afforded many jokes to the army. One anecdote went the round. A Bantam died of disease, and he would, said General Haldane, and a comrade came to see his corpse. "Shut ze door when you come out," said the old woman of his billet. "Fermez la porte, mon vieux." The living Bantam went to see the dead one, and came downstairs much moved by grief. "I've seed poor Bill," he said. "As tu ferme la porte?" said the old woman, anxiously. The Bantam wondered at the anxious inquiry, asked the reason of it. "Si, Esther cause du chat," said the old woman. "Ze cat, monsieur, he have had your friend in ze passage 3 time already today. Trois fois." Poor little men born of diseased civilization. They were volunteers to a man, and some of them with as much courage as soldiers twice their size. They were the Bantams who told me of the Anglican padre at Longueville. It was Father Hall of Merefield, attached to the South African Brigade. He came out to a dressing station established in the one bit of ruin which could be used for shelter, and devoted himself to the wounded with a spiritual fervor. They were suffering horribly from thirst, which made their tongues swell and set their throats on fire. "Water," they cried, "water! For Christ's sake, water!" There was no water, except at a well in Longueville, under the fire of German snipers, who picked off our men when they crawled down like wild dogs with their tongues lolling out. There was one German officer there in a shell hole not far from the well, who sat with his revolver handy, and he was a dead shot. But he did not shoot the padre. Something in the face and figure of that chaplain, his disregard of the bullets snapping about him, the upright, fearless way in which he crossed that way of death, held back the trigger finger of the German officer, and he let him pass. He passed many times, untouched by bullets or machine gun fire, and he went into bad places, pits of horror, carrying hot tea, which he made from the well water for men in agony. Part 6, Chapter 17. During these battles I saw thousands of German prisoners and studied their types and physiognomy, and, by permission of intelligence officers, spoke with many of them in their barbed wire cages or on the field of battle when they came along under escort. Some of them looked degraded, bestial men. One could imagine them guilty of the foulest atrocities. But in the mass they seemed to me decent, simple men, remarkably like our own lads from the Saxon counties of England, though not quite so bright and brisk, as was only natural in their position, as prisoners, with all the misery of war in their souls. Afterward they worked with patient industry in the prison camps, and established their own discipline, and gave very little trouble if well handled. In each crowd of them there were fellows who spoke perfect English, having lived in England as waiters and hairdressers, or clerks or mechanics. It was with them I spoke most, because it was easiest, but I know enough German to talk with the others, and I found among them all the same loathing of war, the same bewilderment as to its causes, the same sense of being driven by evil powers above them. The officers were different. They lost a good deal of their arrogance, but to the last had excuses ready for all that Germany had done, and almost to the last professed to believe that Germany would win. Their sense of caste was in their nature. They refused to travel in the same carriages with their men, to stay even for an hour in the same enclosures with them. They regarded them, for the most part, as inferior beings, and there were castes even among the officers. I remember that in the last phase, when we captured a number of cavalry officers, these elegant sky blue fellows held aloof from the infantry officers and would not mix with them. One of them paced up and down all night alone, and all next day, stiff in the corsets below that sky blue uniform, not speaking to a soul, though within a few yards of him were many officers of infantry regiments. Our men treated their prisoners, nearly always, after the blood of battle was out of their eyes, with a good-natured kindness that astonished the Germans themselves. I have seen them filling German water bottles at considerable trouble, and the escorts, 2 or 3 to a big batch of men, were utterly trustful of them. "Here, hold my rifle, Fritz," said one of our men, getting down from a truck train to greet a friend. An officer standing by took notice of this. "Take your rifle back at once. Is that the way to guard your prisoners?" Our man was astonished. "Lord bless you, sir, they don't want no guarding. They're glad to be took. They guard themselves." "Your men are extraordinary," a German officer told me. They asked me whether I would care to go down at once or wait till the barrage had passed. He seemed amazed at that thoughtfulness for his comfort. It was in the early days of the Somme fighting, and crowds of our men stood on the banks above a sunken road, watching the prisoners coming down. This officer who spoke to me had an iron cross, and the men wanted to see it and handle it. "Will they give it back again?" he asked, nervously, fumbling at the ribbon. "Certainly," I assured him. He handed it to me, and I gave it to the men, who passed it from one to the other, and then back to the owner. "Your men are extraordinary," he said. "They are wonderful." One of the most interesting prisoners I met on the field of battle was a tall, black-bearded man whom I saw walking away from Le Boisselle when that place was smoking with shell bursts. An English soldier was on each side of him, and each man carried a handbag, while this black-bearded giant chatted with them. It was a strange group, and I edged nearer to them and spoke to one of the men. "Who's this? Why do you carry his bags?" "Oh, we're giving him special privileges," said the man. "He stayed behind to look after our wounded. Said his job was to look after wounded, whoever they were. So there he's been in a dugout bandaging our lads. And no joke, either. It's hell up there. We're glad to get out of it." I spoke to the German doctor and walked with him. He discussed the philosophy of the war simply and with what seemed like sincerity. "This war," he said, with a sad, ironical laugh, "we go on killing one another to no purpose. Europe is being bled to death and will be impoverished for long years. We Germans thought it was a war for culture, our civilization. Now we know it is a war against culture, against religion, against all civilization." "How will it end?" I asked him. "I see no end to it," he answered. "It is the suicide of nations. Germany is strong, and England is strong, and France is strong. It is impossible for one side to crush the other, so when is the end to come?" I met many other prisoners then and a year afterward who could see no end of the massacre. They believed the war would go on until living humanity on all sides revolted from the unceasing sacrifice. In the autumn of 1918, when at last the end came in sight, by German defeat, unexpected a few months before, even by the greatest optimist in the British armies, the German soldiers were glad. They did not care how the war ended so long as it ended. Defeat, what did that matter? Was it worse to be defeated than for the race to perish by bleeding to death? Part 6, Chapter 18. The struggle for the Pozieres Ridge and High Wood lasted from the beginning of August until the middle of September. 6 weeks of fighting, as desperate as any in the history of the world until that time. The Australians dealt with Pozieres itself, working round Mocave Farm, where the Germans refused to be routed from their tunnels, and up to the windmill on the high ground of Pozieres, for which there was unceasing slaughter on both sides because the Germans counter-attacked again and again, and waves of men surged up and fell around that mound of forsaken brick, which I saw as a reddish cone through flame and smoke. Those Australians whom I had seen arrive in France had proved their quality. They had come believing that nothing could be worse than their ordeal in the Dardanelles. Now they knew that Pozieres was the last word in frightfulness. The intensity of the shell fire under which they lay shook them, if it did not kill them. Many of their wounded told me that it had broken their nerve. They would never fight again without a sense of horror. "Our men are more highly strung than the English," said one Australian officer, and I was astonished to hear these words, because those Australians seemed to me without nerves and as tough as gristle in their fibre. They fought stubbornly, grimly, in ground so ravaged with fire that the earth was finely powdered. They stormed the Pozieres Ridge yard by yard, and held its crest under sweeping barrages which tore up their trenches as soon as they were dug, and buried and mangled their living flesh. In 6 weeks they suffered 20,000 casualties, and Pozieres now is an Australian graveyard, and the memorial that stands there is to the ghosts of that splendid youth which fell in heaps about that plateau and the slopes below. Many English boys of the Sussex, West Kent, Surrey, and Warwick regiments in the 18th Division died at their side, not less patient in sacrifice, not liking it better. Many Scots of the 15th and 9th Divisions, many New Zealanders, many London men of the 47th and 56th Divisions fell, killed or wounded, to the right of them, on the way to Martinpuich and Aucourt el Abai and Flers, from High Wood and Longueville and Baysentin. The 3D Division of Yorkshires and Northumberland Fusiliers, Royal Scots and Gordons were earning that name of the Iron Division, and not by any easy heroism. Every division in the British Army took its turn in the bloodbath of the Somme, and was duly blooded at a cost of 25%, and sometimes 50%, of their fighting strength. The Canadians took up the struggle at Courcelette and captured it in a fierce and bloody battle. The Australians worked up on the right of the Albert Bapaume road to Thillet and Ligny-Thillier. On the far left, the fortress of Tiefel had fallen at last, after repeated and frightful assaults, which I watched from ditches close enough to see our infantry Wildsires and Worcesters of the 25th Division trudging through infernal fire. And then at last, after 5 months of superhuman effort, enormous sacrifice, mass heroism, desperate willpower, and the tenacity of each individual human ant in this wild ant heap, the German lines were smashed, the Australians surged into Bapaume, and the enemy, stricken by the prolonged fury of our attack, fell back in a far and wide retreat across a country which he laid waste to the shelter of his Hindenburg line, from Bullecourt to St. Quentin. Part 6, Chapter 19. The goal of our desire seemed attained when at last we reached Bapaume, after these terrific battles in which all our divisions, numbering nearly 1 million men, took part, with not much difference in courage, not much difference in average of loss. By the end of that year's fighting, our casualties had mounted up to the frightful total of 400,000 men. Those fields were strewn with our dead. Our graveyards were growing forests of little white crosses. The German dead lay in heaps. There were 1,200 corpses littered over the earth, below Loupart Wood, in one mass, and 800 of them were German. I could not walk without treading on them there. When I fell in the slime, I clutched arms and legs. The stench of death was strong and awful. But our men who had escaped death and shell shock kept their sanity through all this wilderness of slaughter, kept, oh, marvelous, their spirit of humor, their faith in some kind of victory. I was with the Australians on that day when they swarmed into Bapaume, and they brought out trophies like men at a country fair. I remember an Australian colonel who came riding with a German beer mug at his saddle. Next day, though shells were still bursting in the ruins, some Australian boys set up some painted scenery which they had found among the rubbish and chalked up the name of the Cooee Theatre. The enemy was in retreat to his Hindenburg line, over a wide stretch of country which he laid waste behind him, making a desert of French villages and orchards and parks, so that even the fruit trees were cut down, and the churches blown up, and the graves ransacked for their lead. It was the enemy's first retreat on the Western Front, and that ferocious fighting of the British troops had smashed the strongest defences ever built in war, and our raw recruits had broken the most famous regiments of the German army. So in spite of all tragedy and all agony, our men were not downcast, but followed up their enemy with a sense of excitement because it seemed so much like victory and the end of war. When the Germans retreated from Gommecourt, where so many boys of the 56th London Division had fallen on the 1st of July, I went through that evil place by way of Fonkevelers, which we called Funky Villas, and, stumbling over the shell craters and broken trenches and dead bodies between the dead masts of slashed and branchless trees, came into the open country to our outpost line. I met there a friendly sergeant who surprised me by referring in a casual way to a little old book of mine. "This place," he said, glancing at me, "is a strange street of adventure." It reminded me of another reference to that tale of mine when I was among a crowd of London lads who had just been engaged in a bloody fight at a place called the Hairpin. A young officer sent for me, and I found him in the loft of a stinking barn, sitting in a tub as naked as he was born. "I just wanted to ask you," he said, "whether Catherine married Frank?" The sergeant at Gommecourt was anxious to show me his own street of adventure. "I belong to Tok Emmas," he said, meaning trench mortars, "and my officers would be very pleased if you would have a look at their latest stunt. We've got a 9.2 mortar in Pigeon Wood, away beyond the infantry. It's never been done before, and we're going to blow old Fritz out of Kite Copse." I followed him into the blue, as it seemed to me, and we fell in with a young officer also on his way to Pigeon Wood. He was in a merry mood, in spite of harassing fire round about and the occasional howl of a 5.9. He kept stopping to look at enormous holes in the ground and laughing at something that seemed to tickle his sense of humour. "See that?" he said. "That's old Charlie Lowndes' work." At another pit in upheaved earth he said, "That's Charlie Lowndes again. Old Charlie gave him hell. He's a topping chap. You must meet him, my God. Look at that." He roared with laughter again on the edge of an unusually large crater. "Who is Charlie?" I asked. "Where can I find him?" "Oh, we shall meet him in Pigeon Wood. He's as pleased as Punch at having got beyond the infantry. First time it has ever been done. Took a bit of doing, too, with the largest size of Tok Emma." We entered Pigeon Wood after a long walk over wild chaos, and, guided by the officer and sergeant, I dived down into a deep dugout just captured from the Germans, who were 200 yards away in Kite Copse. "What cheer, Charlie?" shouted the young officer. "Hullo, fellow my lad, come in. We're getting gloriously binged on a rare find of German brandy. Topping, and I've brought a visitor." Captain Charles Lowndes, dear old Charlie, received us most politely in one of the best dugouts I ever saw, with smoothly panelled walls fitted up with shelves and good deal furniture made to match. "This is a nice little home in hell," said Charles. "At any moment, of course, we may be blown to bits, but meanwhile, it is very comfy down here, and what makes everything good is a bottle of rare old brandy and an unlimited supply of German soda water. Also, to add to the gaiety of indecent minds, there is a complete outfit of ladies' clothing in a neighbouring dugout. Funny fellows, those German officers. Take a pew, won't you, and have a drink, orderly." He shouted for his man and ordered a further supply of German soda water. We drank to the confusion of the enemy, in his own brandy and soda water, out of his own mugs, sitting on his own chairs at his own table, and dear old Charlie, who was a little etoile, as afterward I became, with a sense of deep satisfaction. The noise of shells seemed more remote, discoursed on war, which he hated, German psychology, trench mortar barrages. They had simply blown the Boche out of Gommecourt, and his particular fancy stunt of stealing a march on the infantry, who, said Captain Lowndes, are laps behind. Other officers crowded into the dugout. One of them said, "You must come round to mine. It's a blasted palace." And I went round later, and he told me on the way that he had escaped so often from shell bursts that he thought the average of luck was up, and he was bound to get done in before long. Charlie Lowndes dispensed drinks with noble generosity. There was much laughter among us, and afterward we went upstairs and to the edge of the wood, to which a heavy, wet mist was clinging, and I saw the trench mortar section play the devil with kite copse over the way. Late in the afternoon I took my leave of a merry company in that far-flung outpost of our line, and wished them luck. A few shells crashed through the wood as I left, but I was disdainful of them after that admirable brandy. It was a long walk back to Funky Villas, not without the interest of arithmetical calculations about the odds of luck in harassing fire. But 1,000 yards or so from Pigeon Wood I looked back and saw that the enemy had begun to take notice. Heavy shells were smashing through the trees there ferociously. I hoped my friends were safe in their dugouts again. And I thought of the laughter and gallant spirit of the young men. After 5 months of the greatest battles in the history of the world, it seemed to me wonderful.
This concludes the 14th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.